The first thing they noticed wasn't the barbed wire. It was the smell. Bread. Fresh, yeasty, impossible bread, wafting across a muddy French field under a sky still bruised by artillery. A line of German prisoners, wrists empty of weapons and faces scabbed with fatigue, tilted their heads like hounds. Beyond a hedge, American soldiers in stained aprons slid rows of brown loaves from a metal oven mounted on a trailer. Steam rose into the cool morning. A private laughed at something the baker said, tore a heel off a loaf, blew on it, and ate it standing up, his helmet at the back of his head like a forgotten burden. Later, one of the prisoners would tell his Red Cross interviewer that this was the moment it broke in him. Not the roar of American tanks or the black rain of aircraft. Bread. In Germany, bread had been counted, sliced thin, made to last. On the Eastern Front, men had chewed frozen crusts and called it dinner. Here, the enemy made bread beside a battlefield, as if it were a ritual, as if logistics were a kind of faith. German prisoners of war captured in North Africa, in Sicily and Italy, in the bocage of Normandy, in the Ardennes white woods arrived in American hands carrying more than rifles and fieldcraft. They carried an idea of war, that it devoured everything and left scraps. Then they met the United States appetite, which was larger and stranger than anything in their training. The Americans fed you first. They fed themselves always. They fed in ways that seemed impossible: bacon on a beach, coffee after midnight, stew in a rainstorm, bread under shellfire, chocolate bars that did not melt in a Pacific sun. To men whose army fed on horse-drawn kitchens and ration scales shaved thinner every month, the question formed not as an argument, but as a bewilderment. How do they do it? We tend to tell the story of war with bullets and flags, with movements on maps that look clean and elegant in hindsight. But the long shadow cast across the 20th century was made by ships and warehouses, by cows turned into cans, by steel drums of coffee humped off docks, by men who knew the trick of moving a ton with a practiced lean. The German POW, who stared at a field bakery in Normandy, was looking at more than dough. He was looking at the central difference between two industrial nations fighting with different assumptions about time, distance, and the dignity of a meal. In North Africa in 1943, Africa Corps men bowed under the sun and swallowed dust for breakfast. When captured, they were marched past American mess lines where cooks ladled beans and pork into deep steel trays, dropped a square of cornbread, slid apples down the line like coins. The prisoners stared. Apples? A sergeant with a cigarette stuck to his lower lip swallowed hard. In America, he'd been told they ate steak. They drove everywhere. They were soft. He did not feel soft watching the way these men lined up their field stoves, how they broke down a crate and folded it flat for later, how they cleaned their ladles with boiling water and a rag until they gleamed like instruments in a surgery. He felt something else, the weight of a fact you do not want and cannot refuse. In the Pacific, rain came in swords. Marines huddled in muddy holes that filled up faster than you could bail them. And then a truck ground into a cleared patch, and a corporal climbed into the bed and shouted over the water, "Hot chow." The line formed without ceremony. Steam rose from insulated containers. A German soldier on Bougainville captured, with a handful of Japanese allies after a mislaid sortie, had never touched American food. He held a bowl in both hands and felt it heat his fingers through the tin. Thick stew, coffee. He drank too fast and burned his tongue. He laughed, a short broken sound. It was not the taste. It was what the taste implied. All this seemed to them like magic. It was not magic. It was a machine. The Quartermaster Corps, the Army Service Forces, the Navy's Bureau of Supplies and Accounts. Refrigerated ships and rail cars. Canneries that ran all night. Bakeries that traveled on wheels. Warehouses that turned chaos into stacks and stacks into meals. A doctrine that said a soldier fights best who eats best. The United States had wrapped a continent's worth of fields, factories, and freight depots into a pipeline so steady that you could plan your life by it even when no one could promise you another sunrise. The POWs took it in with their eyes because the mouth betrayed you in the presence of food. They memorized labels Hormel, Swift, Hershey, Maxwell House, the way they would once have traced the chromed letters on a car. In their letters home, where censors let ink pass when it wounded no one, they wrote with a careful mixture of shame and wonder. We get meat here. We get eggs. We get coffee. Always coffee. We do not understand. They did not expect to understand. They expected to record. Look long enough at a loaf of bread, and you will see a map. Wheat fields in Kansas rising and falling like a slow-breathing animal. Combines cutting wide swaths while boys in denim wave from hitching steps. Flour mills whose windows glow at 3 in the morning. A train that carries sacks across a river whose surface looks like pounded pewter. A dock where men hook their hands into cargo nets and ride them down because it is the fastest way to move. A ship with cold holds that don't sweat despite the heat. A beach that was a battlefield yesterday and will be a kitchen tomorrow. A baker with flour on his forearms who grins at you and says, "Take the end. It's best." Germany. As prisoners found themselves captive to a narrative they had not anticipated, one where food was proof of power as much as tanks were, where abundance did not blunt the will to fight, but sharpened the purpose of men sent away from home. The surprise was not only that America could feed millions of soldiers so easily, it was that it chose to make feeding them as easy as possible, even when everything else seemed impossible. The mystery began with bread. It widened to a question that will guide our story. What combination of land, labor, machinery, and intention let a nation turn meals into momentum? And what did those meals tell a conquered enemy about the world that had beaten him? To understand the astonishment of men in gray staring at American mess kits, you have to leave the battlefield and watch the engine from its first turn. Begin in a field that looks infinite. The United States entered the war with farms that had already mechanized through the lean lessons of the Depression. Tractors muscled rows where teams of horses had once sweated. Combines ate wheat and spat it into hoppers. Trucks growled in from gravel roads and loaded on the move. A harvest crew that would have taken a week with scythes finished in a day. Women in bandanas and boys with sunburned shoulders added hands where the draft had taken them away. The yield climbed. Grain elevators filled, then emptied into chutes that rattled like dry thunder. Chicago's skyline played its own music in that symphony. Meatpacking houses, an empire of tile and steam, sharpened knives and kept them bright. Cattle went in at one end. Barrels and boxes came out the other, stamped with names that read like grocery lists. The canning industry, already a giant, found gears it had not yet used. Peas, beans, pork, corned beef, fruit, milk poured into metal and sealed with a sound like a door closing on doubt. Dehydration plants sprang up and turned potatoes and onions into flakes and powder that would hydrate like conjuring a meal on a cold night in France. Those plants worked because railroads worked. Trains like moving towns kept every promise they ever made, hauling grain east and cans west and coal to wherever engines burned so that nothing fell out of rhythm. There were miracles in the middle no one saw. Standardized packaging turned chaos into order. The unit load pallet, wooden slats nailed with a logic so simple it looked like child's play, let warehouses stack lives in 3 dimensions. Forklifts, their tires scarred, their forks bright at the tips threaded narrow aisles with a dancer's confidence and lifted a ton with 2 fingers on a lever. Boxes were cut to sizes that fit exactly. 1 case of canned meat, plus 1 of biscuits, plus 1 of coffee and sugar, strapped together, meant 1 squad for 1 day. 4 such clusters meant a 10-man ration for 10 days. You could describe war in many ways. One true way was this: a ledger in which 10 meals were a unit. A pallet was a paragraph. A ship's manifest was a novel, and every page mattered. The Quartermaster Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago smelled like a kitchen and a factory at the same time. Scientists in white coats sat beside sergeants in fatigues and tasted their way toward compromises. The Hershey emergency bar that would keep a man alive without tempting him to eat it in one night. The tropical bar that wouldn't liquefy in a Marine's pocket in August. Canned bread that stayed whole on a shelf and made toast under a field stove's top plate. Powdered eggs that surprised men used to hens. Dried milk that made cocoa in a shell hole with water you dared not think too much about. They tested seams that would not blow at altitude. They taught tin to endure. They made sure a label told the truth. This will be edible after a rough voyage and a rougher landing. On the coast, shipyards' hammers wrote a rhythm like rain. Liberty ships slid into water with the awkward grace of something powerful learning its body. Victory ships followed, faster, tighter. Refrigerated holds reefer spaces made cold a commodity at sea. You could load beef in New Orleans and eat it fresh in Oran 2 weeks later if the convoy held and the weather played fair. You could pack butter and keep it honest. The cold chain ran down gangways into refrigerator rail cars and out to depots with names that sounded like passwords whispered to men who had waited a long time to exhale. Gorak, Cherbourg, Antwerp, Oran. The ports mattered as much as anything. You cannot feed an army if you cannot land food without destroying it. The Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, turned beaches into docks. They set pontoon causeways that took trucks straight off ships and onto sand, turned open roadsteads into improvised harbors. Behind them, engineers built depots that stretched toward the horizon-tent cities of crates and barrels arranged by class. Class 1 for food, Class 2 for clothing and equipment, Class 3 for fuel, Class 4 for construction, and Class 5 for ammunition. Everything had a place, and if it didn't, someone made one by the end of the day. The doctrine flowed from top to bottom. The soldier must eat hot when possible, eat enough always, and eat in ways that keep his mind where it belongs. Food was not charity. It was combat power. The Army SB rationed the open kitchen set, where a field stove turned raw ingredients into meals, gave cooks the chance to improvise soups and stews from crates stamped U.S. and barrels marked with black stenciled numbers. When conditions turned the world to mud and shrapnel, the sea ration took over. With canned meat and vegetable combos you could heat directly in the can and a small package of biscuits, beverage powder, sugar, and cigarettes that turned a tin key into a salvation. The K ration lighter, meant for movements, 3 little boxes for breakfast, dinner. Supper came in waxed cardboard that shed rain and worry. The 10-in-1 ration landed wherever trucks could not, a wooden puzzle whose solution was morale. Coffee flowed like a sacrament. The United States was sweat and caffeine. Mess sergeants boiled it by the gallon. Thermos jugs kept it honest. Mess kits made room for it. In camps, new arrivals measured the war's temperature by how fast their cup was refilled without asking. In foxholes, a buddy on watch was a buddy, willing to pour a little into a canteen cup when you cracked an eye at 2 in the morning. At every corner of the supply chain, someone watched the coffee. It mattered. This system, the fields, the factories, the forklifts, the docks, the trains, the reefer holds, the pallets and the plans built a pipeline that looked inevitable only once it ran. It never was. Hundreds of thousands of workers, black and white, men and women, immigrants and farm kids, brought it to life each shift. Longshoremen developed new slings that caught crates without breaking them. Clerks wrote numbers until their fingers cramped. Drivers learned routes that didn't exist the day before. The miracle was cumulative. No one chose greatness for breakfast. Together, they made it anyway. In Germany, civilians had been taught for a generation that blockade was a brute force that bent nations. World War I had starved cities and stunted children. World War II felt at first as if the nation had found a way to cheat that fate with speed and conquest. But the net tightened. U-boats sank ships, but not enough. Allied bombers smashed rail yards and factories. Fields produced, but the fuel to move food was scarce. Rations grew cautious. Fat was a memory. Coffee was a rumor made from roasted barley. They watched, amazed, as America stepped over the old cliff of scarcity and built a bridge out of cans and confidence. That, more than anything, wrote the astonishment into prisoners' faces when the mess line opened near them and steam rose. This was not just another army. This was a people who had learned how to turn a continent into a kitchen and keep it open, even in a storm. At the front, the system turned from plan into appetite. Men swore by their rations and swore at them. 3 little cardboard boxes tucked inside a combat jacket could decide whether a long patrol felt like decent work or punishment. The K ration looked like nothing much. A can of cheese or meat, crackers, a sugar tablet, a wad of chewing gum, 4 cigarettes, a packet of instant coffee, sometimes a bar of that stubborn Hershey chocolate you had to gnaw like a commitment. Breakfast might include dried fruit, dinner a bit of luncheon meat, supper a small tin of ham and eggs that tasted better than it sounded if you were cold enough. It was designed for short campaigns and quick movements. Men stretched it across weeks because movement seldom obeyed design. Still, it could be warmed over a candle. A man who had been hungry for long enough could convince himself it tasted like home. The C ration, heavier, gave more. Meat and vegetable stew, beans with franks, hash a vocabulary of brown and salt that filled the hole. Open with the key soldered to the can. Heat if you could. Eat cold if you couldn't. The B unit tin held biscuits, sugar, coffee, sometimes chocolate. For variety, soldiers traded between units like schoolboys. You hated the same menu until you missed it like a tooth, and then you would trade a lot for one specific can that had once made a bad day good. When the fight paused or the line held firm, the field kitchen arrived like a rumor that turned out to be true. Cooks coaxed flame from gasoline burners, wrestled sacks of flour, opened cans with arm-long keys, and poured their contents into kettles so big they seemed theatrical. Onion, canned tomatoes, meat, salt, some pepper saved for a day like this stir with a paddle until the scent moved down the line and found the men who had learned to expect nothing. Bowls filled. Cigarettes could be tucked behind an ear and saved. Coffee came after. Bread if they had it. A slice of yellow butter melting over the crust made men look down at their hands, embarrassed by the luxury. Field bakery companies arrived with ovens that could be bolted together anywhere. In North Africa, they set up under stars that looked shredded by wind. In Italy, they used monasteries' courtyards as impromptu kitchens. In Normandy, they rolled ovens under camouflage netting and watched the horizon while the dough rose. They could produce tens of thousands of loaves a day across a theater. Bread stiffened spines. It told men their effort was noticed by someone whose face they would never see. Food delivered jokes and tradition across oceans. Coca-Cola promised 5 cents a bottle to every soldier, then built bottling plants close to the front so that promise could be kept. Mechanics in khaki turned into soda men between engine rebuilds. Cold glass in a hot hand made men who had seen too much close their eyes and be young for a sip as length. Bottlers in North Africa, in New Guinea, in Belgium all wore the same patch, poured the same syrup into the same green bottles, linked strangers to Atlanta in a loop of sugar and memory. By war's end, Coca-Cola had poured billions of servings and taught a generation that a small, sweet ritual could be as much a piece of home as a letter. Hershey's assembly lines, miles from the front, turned cacao and sugar and powdered milk into bars that tolerated heat, survived in pockets, and consoled a minute that would otherwise have hurt more than it needed to. The D-ration bar tasted like a bad idea that saved lives anyway. The tropical bar tasted like a compromise with the equator. Men laughed about them and hoarded them. A captured German corporal at Anzio turned a Hershey wrapper over and over between his fingers as if it might give him a secret. "For soldiers," he said to an American guard, in the tone a man uses when he understands a priest's Latin for the first time. Beyond the individual bite, the machine moved on wheels. In France, the Red Ball Express roared day and night from ports to the front, a convoy ballet of trucks painted with a red ball symbol drivers. Eyes raw from dust and late hours, tires worn thin by the simple act of doing the necessary thing too many times. They hauled everything: fuel, shells, blankets, socks, and food. Pallets of rations, sacks of flour, barrels of coffee, crates of fruit that bruised the minute a man smiled at them. When a kitchen ran out of sugar, a sergeant worked the phones and found a driver who could slide a few bags off the back in the next hour. When an infantry battalion spent itself on an objective and dug in shivering, a quartermaster lieutenant took it personally. He would find a way to get them hot chow on the worst road you ever saw. In the Pacific, the ocean was a supply line and a threat. Amphibious operations depended on planners who could picture breakfast in a place where there would be no road, no dock, not even dry ground to stand on for the first hours. Beachmasters orchestrated chaos. Boats surfed in, ramps crashed down. Marines jumped into water and turned back, just long enough to grab a crate and haul it to a patch of sand that had no business being called a depot. On Saipan and Tinian, Seabees blasted coral and built piers before lunch, then widened airstrips after dark. Refrigerated locker ships moored offshore and fed more than the men on their own decks. They were floating pantries that measured success by how many hamburgers you could grill in the lee of a coconut grove. German prisoners watched this ballet whenever their custody brushed the edge of an American base. They saw the pace, and they saw the attitude that turned logistics into swagger. A guard joked with a cook while tossing a sack of potatoes from one truck to another. A corporal leaned against a forklift, smoked, and then moved 20 crates with a look of casual malice against gravity. Nothing in the German army looked like that. Their field kitchens goulash cannons, trailers with kettles that clanked, were old friends and did holy work when fuel and food reached them, but they did not move like this, did not multiply like this, did not seem inevitable like this. Americans could complain about their food and did. C rations wore out their welcome. K rations sapped energy if used too long. Beans came too often. In Italy, men swore one afternoon they would never eat another can of corned beef hash, and fought for a spoonful when the next day's rain made everything colder. But beneath the grumbling lay gratitude and something like awe that the machine kept turning. In the worst moments at Hurtgen, at Anzio, in the Ardennes, when the forest froze and the sky locked, someone still found a way to brew coffee. A lieutenant on a bare hill in the Vosges, who had not slept in 2 days, stared at a tin cup that steamed like a blessing and thought, only half ironically, "This is why we will win." To fully measure the shock in a German prisoner's eyes, you have to look back along his own supply line. The Wehrmacht entered the war with a doctrine of speed and nerve, and with a logistics system that still relied heavily on horsepower in the most literal sense. By 1941, German divisions filled roads east with hooves and wheels. The last miles into Russia were measured in mud and dead animals. Railways brought bread and tinned meat to the division's backyards. From there, horses and a few trucks tried to carry it forward. In summer dust, you could do it. In autumn mud and winter ice, dreams soaked into the ground. The German field kitchen, the goulash cannon, was a proud invention. An iron cauldron on a limber, a chimney and firebox below, a second kettle beside it for coffee or soup. Men loved the sight of it rolling into a bivouac with smoke trickling from its stack. The problem was not the kitchen, It was everything else. Fuel ran short. Meat shrank on the ration scale each year. Fat became precious. Coffee turned to substitutes that tasted like pretend mornings. Bread came hard and stayed that way. The army could fight like lightning and eat like a monastery. That was sustainable for weeks. The world became larger than weeks. The Reich fed itself under siege twice in a lifetime. The First World War's blockade had taught harsh lessons about fat and protein. In the second, the regime tried to cheat the arithmetic by conquest and seizure. Poland's grain and Ukraine's fields were fated to feed Germans. Occupied France and the Low Countries were to be pantries, their shelves picked by requisition. Where the Wehrmacht advanced, hunger followed for others. But theft is not a supply chain. An army cannot live on confiscation alone, and the weight of the war pushed back harder than planners believed possible. Submarines could not cut Allied lifelines enough. Bombers could reach Stuttgart and Essen in the night and make morning's train schedule meaningless. The lines on the map said the Reich was large. The stomach said, "You are smaller than you think." In North Africa, Rommel's men ate the taste of logistics. Dock units received tin after tin of Italian rations that came late and broke on the voyage. Pasta without sauce. Dry biscuits that shattered and tasted like dust's cousin. A German sergeant found a British bully beef tin in a burned-out carrier and cried right there beside it, quick and angry for a moment, then laughed at himself because he was a man among men and the world needed him to be something other than a pair of empty hands. When captured, these soldiers met American mess lines and confronted an idea. The enemy's appetite was bigger than yours, and it served him. On the Eastern Front, the eating turned cruel. Policy directed theft on a scale that made starving people a feature, not a failure. German soldiers were told to live off the land where possible, to take what they needed. Many felt shame and refused when they could. Many did not have that choice. Winter came. Logistics froze. The army ate one ancient stew repeated. Pea soup, barley, thin meat when it arrived. Men told each other stories of New World plenty, as if it were a fairy tale. Cows like small houses. Factories that made cans faster than a man could blink coffee that came in bags, so big 2 men had to carry them. They intended contempt, but delivered longing. By 1944, German rations had dropped in calories and in spirit. A frontline soldier might receive a scale that looked acceptable on paper, and watch it wither in the chain between depot and foxhole. Fat a soldier's friend in winter became a rumor. Ersatz was a survivor word. Ersatz butter, ersatz coffee, ersatz cigarettes. Where America solved problems with standardization, Germany used ingenuity to bend scarcity. It worked for machines until it didn't. It seldom worked for stomachs. Then the prisoners came west. Ultimately, about 425,000 German POWs crossed the Atlantic into camps spread across the United States. They stepped off trains into air that smelled like bakery and diesel, like freshly cut wood and coffee that had not been brewed yet. Under the Geneva Convention, they were to receive rations comparable to those of their captors. In practice, the United States did something radical. It fed them well, not as a gift, as a statement to the world, to itself about law, and about how a confident nation behaves. On farms in the Midwest, POWs worked and ate with the people who hired them by day. They picked tomatoes, shocked wheat, dug sugar beets. At lunch, they sat in the shade and ate sandwiches, pie wrapped in wax paper, apples glistening where a bite had broken the skin. A Nebraska farmer's daughter watched a young prisoner close his eyes over a slice of peach pie, and later said that for a long minute, every war in the world fell quiet. In Texas, a group of prisoners assigned to a canning plant gained weight. One wrote in a letter that the ration scale must be misprinted. Another scrawled to his wife that the Americans were trying to make him soft with food and music on Sunday. In camps, mess halls served meat 2 or 3 times a week, bread daily, coffee every morning. Kitchens taught new rules. Clean your station, label everything, first in first out, do not waste. German NCOs organized their men by habit. American quartermasters provided ingredients and supervision, and nodded when a soup tasted like something a grandmother would recognize. Red Cross parcels arrived with extras chocolate, jam, and a prisoner could barter between barracks for a better breakfast. There were feasts on holidays that tasted almost cruel to men thinking of home turkey and potatoes and gravy, and the sort of laughter that both warmed a room and rebuked a winter. Not every guard was kind, not every meal what the plan called for. The war could be petty and mean even under a polite roof. But the broad truth held. German POWs in America ate better than they had at home as the Reich collapsed, better than many American civilians under rationing's discipline, and better than they could have imagined in a prison. They were not fools. They saw what it meant. America wielded abundance as a soft power you could taste. It told an enemy, "We will take you in. We will feed you because we can. And because we can, you cannot persuade yourself we are decadent or weak." Captured officers in France wrote in diaries that the United States had achieved what Prussia worshipped: organization without tyranny, plenty without paralysis. Enlisted men returned after the war and told families about coffee you could have twice and chicken. You did not have to steal. A few were asked to stay and did. Many went home with pounds added to their bodies and doubts added to their certainties. The shock of America's kitchen did not win battles. It won minds in small, untraceable ways. The next time that man voted, the memory of bread in a prison might put a finger on the scale. Behind the astonishment lay contrasts that still instruct. One country moved most of its infantry's food on hooves. The other invested in trucks, pallets, forklifts, and the human choreography to use them. One trusted a stew to arrive when it could, and asked men to tighten belts. The other demanded that stew arrive on time, and built a nation's day around that demand. One took from occupied tables. The other sent ships to friends, Lend-Lease canned meat and flour to Britain and Russia, while feeding an army of its own. If you were a German private standing in a muddy pen in Normandy, watching a baker crack a loaf with his thumbs, you were not seeing a moral argument. You were seeing the consequences of choices made far from any trench. When the guns went quiet, the mystery remained in the mouths of men who had been enemies and were now something else, witnesses who had eaten their way into a complicated understanding. German POWs struggled to explain it to families who had queued for cabbage and scraped fat from plates. "They fed us," wrote one, "as if food came from taps. It did not, of course. It came from soil and sweat and steel, from planning as exacting as any war plan, from a democratic habit of making work visible and giving it dignity. But from a distance, it looked like sorcery. And sorcery, when it is generous, changes people. The United States food machine did more than counter hunger. It shortened the war in ways that evade recounting by battles. It kept divisions moving when roads were rumors and weather mean. It let commanders take risks because they could be confident their men would not be fighting on empty. It sent taste as a message. Home is not gone. It is with you in a can, in a cup, in a slice of bread. You can tear with hands that still shake. It turned victories into something you could hold between your fingers and feel cooling against your skin. That mattered as much as any tank sermon or artillery argument. There was a shadow, too. Abundance is not innocence. The same system that fed soldiers flooded allies with food, while civilians in occupied zones starved, their hunger engineered. A pipeline bypassed some needs and overran others. In a war of such scale, fairness is not an outcome. It is an intention that fails as often as it succeeds. To tell the story of how America fed millions of soldiers so easily is not to say that America made no mistakes with its food power. It is to say that it understood food as power at all, and chose to make it generous when it could have been stingy, orderly when it might have been chaotic, and durable when chaos pressed in everywhere. What the German prisoners could not understand at first, they learned to name: infrastructure. A word as dull as a crate, as miraculous as a crate arriving where it should. Railroads that came on time, roads that bore endless weight, ports that turned ships around like a well-run kitchen turns tables on a Friday night, factories that ran because electricity stayed faithful, farms that planted because seed and fuel arrived when the calendar said to, workers who knew that their shift mattered and could see how. The German army had astonishing engineers and brave drivers, good stoves and better cooks, men who would lay their bodies down for a hot meal to reach a trench. It lacked the system that made such bravery a routine instead of a gamble. The men who tasted that system in captivity carried home an impression that outlasted ration cards and rubble. Some would return in the 1950s as guests to the country that had fed them. Some would build their own lives with an eye toward reliability, queues that moved, shelves that stayed full. West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, its economic miracle, bore many fathers' Marshall Plan dollars and German discipline among them. But it was also fed by a memory of what a functioning abundance felt like, of how a nation's confidence tastes when you are offered seconds. In telling this story, the temptation is to let the details blur into a warm portrait of American competence. Resist that. Keep the boxes in view, the sacks of flour, the labels on tins scuffed by 100 fingers. See the longshoreman with a blown-out knee who refuses to miss a shift because he knows the ship must be turned. See the woman in a cannery who tastes the syrup and adjusts the valve because a fraction of a degree means peaches will arrive soft instead of memory hard. See the baker at the edge of a battlefield who pushes a loaf into a prisoner's hands and does not think to look noble doing it. See, too, the German guard who once thought contempt was armor and now sits with a cup of coffee and reconsiders what an army actually needs to be brave. The ending of this story is a small call, barely more than a breath. Remember the invisible labor that turns promise into meals. Remember that feeding people is an argument you make about what kind of country you are and intend to be. In war, it saves lives and wins them. In peace, it does something just as hard. It keeps faith. The last image is ordinary. A mess tent at dawn, canvas damp with dew, a line of men holding metal trays. Somewhere beyond the rise, a POW compound stirs. A cook in a stained apron flips the switch on a field grinder. Coffee beans rattle like dry hail, then crumble into a scent that finds the eyes of men who need it. Bread loaves line a table, their crusts cooling. A truck reverses with a cough, tailgate clanging, and two privates jump down with a crate marked 10 and 1 that has come farther than reason approves. In that moment, as the first ladle of eggs slides onto a plate, you can read the sentence that baffled an enemy and defined a victory. This is a nation that feeds its soldiers like it means to bring them home. We inherit that sentence. We can choose to speak it again in our policies, our planning, our regard for the people who do the quiet work. In a world where hunger is still used as a weapon and scarcity is still a strategy, the lesson that bread on time can change a mind may be the most practical kind of hope. It is not glamorous. It is simply true. And once you have seen it, once you have tasted it under a sky loud with war, you do not forget.